You are listening to That'll Preach. On our show today, we have Dr. Matthew Bingham. He's a theologian and church historian who focuses on the origins of Baptist identity. He's written a book, Orthodox Radicals, about that topic. He's also got a new book out, A Heart Aflame for God, a reformed approach to spiritual formation. Matt, I'm excited to have you on the show to talk about Baptists and their identity, and grateful that you can make the time.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
So I got your contact information and just first heard about you through Ian Clary, who I had on the show in a prior episode. And he mentioned your book, Orthodox Radicals, and said it was really a paradigm-shifting book for him. And it got me interested because, Baptists in church history, and I've said this before, people kind of dunk on the Baptists a little bit. Like, we're the only ones, they're not, Baptistic churches are not rooted in history, and it's not part of the Catholic kind of tradition. And so I'm always fascinated when I come across theologians and historians who write about Baptist identity. And I remember talking to a friend about, today people are really interested in the historical roots of the church. But I think a lot of people in Baptist or Baptistic churches don't have a sense of their own history. And so that's why I think your book is particularly interesting. So I'm curious, just biographically, what got you interested on the topic of Baptist identity and to write a book provocatively titled, I think, it's kind of an interesting title, Orthodox Radicals?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. It's an interesting one. I mean, it's absolutely right what you're saying about Baptists as this sort of, who are they? Where do they come from? I think in some circles, there's just a sort of apathy in terms of what are our historical roots? How do we connect to other traditions? In other Baptist circles, sometimes I think there's some unhelpful kind of myths that have circulated about Baptist origins and roots and connections. So I think clarity is helpful. And it was actually looking for clarity on this subject that got me down the road that eventually led to the book, Orthodox Radicals. I was serving as the pastor of a Calvinistic Baptist church in Southwest Georgia. And we had been moving, the elders and I had been moving in a more confessional direction, moving more toward, we were always Calvinistic and Baptistic, but we were moving more towards the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. And we had taken the position that, okay, this is going to be required for church leadership to affirm, and membership needs to know this is kind of the teaching basis for the church. So we're moving toward some of those historical roots and those historical antecedents. And so what I found was happening was in our new members class, I would talk about some of that I just shared with you about, we're not just Calvinistic in a general sense, but we actually have this confession of faith, and it's called a 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, and this sort of thing. And we would look at that together. And what I found was potential new members were asking what actually, when I started to think about it, were pretty basic, pretty obvious questions. And I felt slightly embarrassed that I didn't have better answers for them. They were starting to, again, not deep, pointed things. They were just saying, so tell me about the people who wrote this, and who were those people, and why did they write this, and what was the context, and it caught me out a bit, and I thought I need to do better. So I started looking into more of the history behind the document, got a better sense for, okay, what's out there in the historical scholarship. And again, what I found was there certainly have been things written about the 1689 and the sort of early modern English Baptists of the 17th century. That exists, but there wasn't as much out there as I was imagining that there would be in terms of historical scholarship, and particularly amongst sort of mainstream historians, operating in research university context. There just hadn't been that much written about the first English Calvinistic Baptists, and some of what was out there was I felt deficient in various ways. So that kind of got me interested and got me down the road, and eventually led to me saying, okay, well, maybe I can do some of that research. And so the book came out of PhD work that I did at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland.
Talk about the title, Orthodox Radicals. What is that? What are you trying to communicate with that? Because it seems like, you have this, you've got those two words. To be Orthodox, it's like to be rooted and grounded in historical creeds and doctrines and all these types of things. And then you've got radicals, which seems like something very different from that. So what kind of goes behind that title?
Yeah, exactly. Orthodox radicals, not to be confused with the radical orthodoxy movement,
Right.
but in any event, yes. So the title, when you start looking at early modern post-Reformation religion in England, and so you're talking about mid-17th century religious developments. So you're talking about the English Civil Wars, and you're talking about the so-called interregnum when Oliver Cromwell came to power. So you're talking about this period of history in the middle of the 17th century in England. And there's a lot of different things happening. And one of the things that gets discussed a lot in the sort of wider historical literature about the period is you have the emergence of what they call radical religion. And the radical religion is a label that historians use to describe a whole broad range of new religious expressions that are emerging during the late 1630s and the 1640s in England. And these new religious expressions are coming to the forefront because the established church, the national church, the Church of England, has sort of effectively collapsed. If not collapsed, it's been severely compromised by the civil wars. So all of a sudden, this religious uniformity that had prevailed no longer prevails. And people can kind of preach what they want and teach what they want and publish what they want in new ways. So historians are interested in that. I'm talking about mainstream secular historians. They're interested in that. And they label it all radical religion. And because it's radical, it's going down to the roots of the old ways and rethinking things. And so you get all these different groups, and some of them are really quite out there, wild things. This is also where you get the emergence of the Quakers, for example, who are still with us in some form. But one of the big expressions that's new are these Baptistic people who do not want to baptize infants. And so traditional historiography labels them as a part of this phenomenon called radical religion. And that's where the radical comes from. But my sense, and the more I looked into this, the more this seemed true to me, is that at least amongst the Calvinistic Baptists, so you have some Calvinistic people who are rejecting Paedobaptism, they're actually not radical, except for this one point. They're rejecting Paedobaptism, yes, but they're not actually radical. Some of these other radical expressions are really out there and rejecting all sorts of things associated with traditional confessional Orthodox creedal Christianity. So, for example, in the mid-17th century in England, you get a group called the Socinians, who are rejecting all sorts of things. They're rejecting the Trinity. They're rethinking the atonement. They're rethinking the person of Christ, all sorts of things. The Baptists, the Calvinistic ones at least, are not like that. They're not questioning fundamentals of the faith. In fact, quite the opposite. They are making every effort to demonstrate a certain harmony and Catholicity and a sense that, hey, we're not crazy. We're not out there. We're not trying to overturn the faith once for all delivered to the saints. What instead we're trying to do is question this one particular piece of doctrine, namely this idea that we should baptize babies. That we're rethinking. And in our minds, say these early modern English Baptists, we're not rethinking that because we're trying to rip up the playbook and start fresh. We're actually seeing this as a logical, doctrinal next step in this process of reform that's been going on since Martin Luther and John Calvin in the 16th century. So they're radical in the sense, and rejection of Paedobaptism in the 17th century was radical. We need to be clear. I mean, nobody was doing this. All Christians from fairly early on agreed. Their rationale for why they were going to baptize a baby would differ, but that you should baptize your baby was a point of widespread agreement. So that was radical. However, unlike some of these other expressions of radical religion, these men and women were actually very self-consciously and intentionally orthodox across the rest of their Christian profession.
Prompted that shift? I mean, did they, in the spirit of Reformation, are they looking at early church fathers and going, we don't see it here? Are they working in covenant categories and going and trying to build on that foundation, like what is the unique shift theologically like that leads them to these newer conclusions?
Well, that is, I think, in some ways, the $1 million question. That's a question that interested me quite a bit, actually. And you mentioned various factors, I think, which would have been there. For example, what does the early church have to say? The men and women we're talking about, whether they were Baptistic or Paedobaptistic or whatever, they were all interested in, familiar with patristic writings. So that was certainly in their kind of world. You mentioned covenant categories, covenant theology. These people were thinking in covenantal terms. Again, they're coming out of, I won't say coming out as though they're leaving, but they're emerging from within a reformed, Orthodox sort of soil. And so to the extent that they're a part of the Reformed tradition, they are thinking covenantally when they try to put their Bibles together. So that's certainly a factor as well. But it's interesting. Why? Why do they reject Paedobaptism? And one of the things you mentioned at the beginning, I think is interesting, as Baptists, often we don't have this real strong sense of being rooted in an historical tradition. And I think part of the thing that obscures the 17th century for us is if we're not really connected to history, to church history, I don't think we realize just how weird it was to reject or question Paedobaptism. Today we're used to it. There's churches everywhere. I'm here in Phoenix. We've got lots of churches. Most of them don't call themselves Baptist churches. They don't use that name,
Right.
But they're not baptizing infants, right? They're just sort of independent, non-denominational evangelical churches, and they are Credo Baptists. So
Right.
I think we're so used to that. Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant grouping of churches in the world. So we're just sort of used to this idea that Baptists exist, and that's a thing. But in the 17th century, they didn't exist, and it wasn't a thing, at least not a very widespread thing. And so to reject it was a big deal. So I think we need a good explanation for why they did that. There were certainly no worldly allurements to rejecting Paedobaptism. All rejecting Paedobaptism brought these guys from a worldly perspective was trouble. It was against the law to question Paedobaptism. It was outside the pale. It associated them with all sorts of strange, really wild characters in the past. So, for example, in the 16th century, in the 1500s, in Munster, in Germany, you had a whole city taken over by people who were called Anabaptists, and they did some very strange things. And so when these people that we're talking about start saying, hey, we have questions about Paedobaptism too, their opponents associate them with these sort of wild groups. In fact, they'll say it explicitly. They'll say, oh, you guys, you are just like your, pestilent brethren in Germany. And they're talking about these Munster people. So anyway, all that is to say, I think you ask a great question. We need a good answer. Like, why would they do this? And what, from a human perspective, kind of motivated them to do this? So how do we answer that? Well, the answer you will get if you look in most history books, and by most, I won't say all, but I mean, most, right? Normal history books on this period, they'll basically present the rejection of Paedobaptism as the sort of product of a kind of pure sola scriptura biblicism. They'll just say, well, these Baptists, they looked and they read their New Testament and they didn't see Paedobaptism in there, so they said, can't do that. Okay, look, it's true that these people were affirming sola scriptura. It's true that they didn't see Paedobaptism explicitly taught or exhibited in the New Testament. That's all true. It's also true that when they started writing their polemical treatises defending Credo Baptism, they would have pointed that out. They would have said, show me in the Bible where this is taught. We're not seeing it. So all that's true, but I think it's incomplete. It's incomplete because the reality is everybody knows and has known for presumably the history of the church that there's no explicit verse saying, "Thou shalt baptize your babies" in the New Testament. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that the book of Acts does not feature an explicit example of an infant being baptized. I understand household baptisms.
Right.
There's a question mark about what's going on there. But in terms of, a description of, and then they took the infants and baptized them, that's not there. Nobody thinks that's there. Everybody's known that for a long time. So, including many, by the time we get to these Baptists in the mid-17th century, many generations of sola scriptura affirming Paedobaptists. So the idea that in the late 1630s and 1640s, when this Baptist thing just sort of explodes, the idea that, well, they just read their Bibles and followed the biblical word. It was clear, right? To me, that is not a sufficient explanation for why it happened when it happened. So I think we have to look a little deeper than that.
Okay, what do you think completes the picture then, beyond just the sola scriptura argument?
Yeah, so I think we can, if we think about the historical context out of which these early English Calvinistic Baptists arose, I think we see a couple clues. One, we see that you have a context in the early 1640s where, as I mentioned, the established church is sort of crumbling and its authority is being compromised by political events. This opens up a space where some of these ideas can be explored and explored in print. So I think that's one clue. But even that isn't enough, because you actually get the first movement towards Baptistic churches in England prior to the collapse of the established church. So you're talking about the late 1630s, 1638, you start to see this phenomenon in earnest. So what's going on? So my take on this question is that the move from Paedobaptism to Credobaptism was downstream from a prior move away from a national church sort of strong top-down polity towards a congregational polity. One thing I find very interesting is that almost all, this is not 100% the case, but almost all of the people who become Baptists during this period become Congregationalists first. And it feels like it's amongst Congregationalists that you see this strong pull towards Credobaptism. And so to me, there's a clue there. All right, what's going on? And so I would say that the prior move towards a congregational polity makes the logic of Paedobaptism less persuasive. And all of a sudden, it starts becoming much more reasonable for people to say, well, hold on, why are we baptizing this baby? And that the answers that they had traditionally been pointing to feel less persuasive to them, given their new ecclesiological reality. So for me, that's the real kind of ground that shifts first. And then after that shift has been made, there's a greater plausibility to a Credobaptist argument than you had before.
That's a really interesting connection. And I was thinking about that because today, Congregationalism and Credobaptism, maybe the connection isn't as strong. I mean, you're talking about there are some, you could be a non-denominational church, you're not necessarily congregational. And then there's also definitions that are different on what constitutes congregational. But I can see that where if you're going from a vision of the church as there's sort of cohesion between civil power, church power, and then you're viewing kind of your citizens as essentially Christians, and that Paedobaptism kind of flows into that. But if you start to have something less established, and now you have more of a voluntary association, well, then that brings up questions about all kinds of other voluntary things. Have they embraced the faith? All these types of things. So that connections, I think that's really intriguing. Can you talk a little bit about that move toward Congregationalism then? Because that seems to be, and that was what was interesting to me, to find out that there were actually Paedobaptist Congregationalists at some point, it seems like, which sounds very odd, but I'm curious about that little transition point. What was that? Can you talk about that transition point when you have the Reformers, you've got these generations subsequent to the Reformers, and then now Congregationalism starts to emerge?
Yeah, and that, I think, is to me the move away from a strong national church in this sort of Constantinian Christendom kind of way is absolutely huge, and it doesn't get discussed as much as it should. And I think one of the reasons it doesn't get discussed as much as it should is because the takeover of that kind of congregational way of thinking about the local church has been so total and so complete in our own day that we just don't think, well, of course we don't have a strong national church where being born into the kingdom is to be baptized into the church, and those two go, hand in glove together. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the 17th century, 1600s in England, at the start of the 17th century, you had this unquestioned dominant national church Constantinian Christendom paradigm. By the end of the 17th century, you don't. And you have actually the monopoly of the state church on English religion has been broken, not just broken functionally because people don't believe it anymore, but actually broken formally as a matter of legal established. They don't disestablish the church, but they pass the Toleration Act, which allows for people to worship legally outside of the national church. And at that point, the established church becomes something rather different. It's the most powerful, yes, obviously the most powerful, the most influential, the most well-connected, the most privileged denomination, as it were, but it's still just one choice among many. So conceptually, by the end of the 17th century, in England, the Church of England is still the established church of England to this very day, nominally. But in any case, so yes, I think this move away from that and towards a different way of thinking about the church is absolutely fundamental. And it starts to get going. It's funny, you mentioned, that we don't hear too much about Paedobaptist and Congregationalist going together, right?
Right.
In our paradigm, our, North American 21st century Christianity, we think about the Paedobaptists are Presbyterians, Lutherans, Anglicans, these sorts of groups, but we don't think about congregationalism. And we tend to think of congregationalism in terms of kind of like, people thinking about in a kind of Baptistic kind of direction. But that was not the case originally. And so congregationalism as a thing that develops in England in the 17th century and then really takes off in North America in the colonies, that begins its life and continues. And to this day, you can still find these expressions as a Paedobaptist expression. It's basically a variation. They're changing some of the ecclesiological principles. They're modifying Presbyterianism in certain ways, but they're retaining all the Reformed theology, which would include Paedobaptism. This really starts, the name you hear associated with it first is a guy called Henry Jacob in 1616. And he becomes one of the first, if not the first person to kind of argue in print that a national church is not biblical. And so he will say the Church of England is not a real church because in the New Testament, the only thing that takes the name of the church, now, of course you have the universal church, right? We're not talking about that, the visible church. But the only, they would say political entity, the only visible entity that receives the name church in the New Testament, says Jacob, is the local congregation. And that's an important shift because you had lots of people before Jacob who went under the name separatist, who would want to separate from the Church of England. But by and large, they would say, look, we want to separate from the Church of England because it's a bad church. It's corrupted. We don't like their doctrine. We don't like their prayer book, et cetera, et cetera. Jacob is saying, actually, no, it's not just that the Church of England has some problems and flaws that could in theory be remedied. Actually, it's just not a real church because the Bible doesn't know this category, at least the New Testament doesn't know this category of a national church. And so he says the church is the local congregation of gathered saints, gathered men and women who are meeting together in one place for the worship of God. And that idea takes off. And lots of people find that compelling, and it gathers steam. And then it's from that congregational move that you start getting some people who say, hey, and you know what, why are we baptizing these babies? So those are related, I think. But again, breaking that hold on this idea that you could speak meaningfully of the church as a political entity that goes beyond the boundary lines of the local congregation. That was a big conceptual move that takes place in this time period.
So how does that develop on? I mean, that shift is pretty. I mean, it's pretty radical, right? I mean, if you're saying that the state church is not a legitimate church, that the church by definition is that local gathering.
And hold on, Brent, I'll just pause there. Yeah. So just so we're clear, and I might have said this in a confusing way, state church and national church are potentially two different things, right? So you could still have you could still have the state funding churches that are organized congregationally. And in fact, in the 1650s, that's what you do get.
Interesting.
The national Episcopalian church is not operative during the 1650s. You have instead churches that are, many of them anyway, congregationally organized, but they're receiving state funding. So the thing that is the real kind of point of order for somebody like a Henry Jacob and the people who follow after him, and this movement that takes the name the Congregational Way, which interestingly, the person who coins that phrase, the Congregational Way, is I believe William Kiffin, who goes on to become one of the leaders of the early Baptist movement. So I think there's a strong connection there. Anyway, all that is to say that national church idea is the big conceptual breakpoint. So this idea that we have one church body that sort of comprehends the whole of the nation, and there is this intrinsic link between your citizenship in the nation and your membership, as it were, in this overarching state church. And so each individual local congregation is actually just sort of one instantiation of this larger Church of England or Church of Ireland or Church of Scotland, etc.
So were there different kinds of congregationalism? I mean, if you have it seems like a Presbyterian congregationalist is an oxymoron, because then you would still have an overarching governing authority over individual local congregations? Or do they only think of it in terms of you can have an overarching authority, but it can't be this national entity that it is? You could potentially have regional authorities. Like were there different species of congregation, or were they just like, no, it's local assembly, local church, that's where authority begins and ends?
So I think the big dividing line is really, is it possible to talk about the church? And again, just to reiterate, we're not talking about that everybody agrees there's a universal church of all God's people and that sort of thing. We're talking about local church. We're talking about visible church structures. They would use the term, a political political structure, a political church, just to mean visible, organized. You can say, yep, it meets on Sundays at 10 in this building, that kind of thing. And so then the big dividing line is it appropriate to refer to anything other than the local congregation as the church in that strong, visible sense? And so some of these congregational writers in the mid-17th century, like one of them, he talks about the difference between his view as a Congregationalist and the Presbyterians. And he says the Presbyterians, they view the church, the visible church, like water, right? So if I have a pitcher of water and I pour it into, 2 cups. I have 2 glasses of water. If I recombine them into one big pitcher, I have 1 pitcher of water, but I can kind of, think of this, it's all water, it's all the same. However, I kind of slice it up. And so in that way, then he's observing that they might have a you mentioned regional, so like a diocesan church. When the diocesan leaders gather, is that a gathering of the church? Well, the Congregationalists would say no. That might be a useful gathering, but that's a gathering of churches, plural, not the church. So, for example, these Congregationalists start policing their language, and when they don't talk about the Church of England, they talk about the churches of England. And for them, that's a meaningful distinction, because they would say that, when lots of leaders from different local congregations get together and gather and deliberate and process, that's not a meeting of the church. That's a meeting of churches together. It might be good. It might be useful. It might bring mutual benefit, but it's not the church, because the New Testament only knows one thing called the church, and that's your local assembly. So that's a big dividing line. And as you say, you're right. Then the offshoot of saying that larger sort of gatherings outside and beyond the local body constitute a gathering of the church. That means that the church can make decisions about itself and its life, and that those decisions are binding on the local assemblies. Whereas from a congregational perspective, if the church is going to make decisions about the church's life, that has to happen at the local level, because that's the only church that the New Testament knows, right? So if a bunch of leaders get together and they talk about stuff and they say, hey, maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that, they can influence each other and help each other and support each other and all that. But at the end of the day, the locus of authority is always on that local congregational level.
How does that start to change as certain congregations become Credo-Baptist? And what does it look like for there to be a Catholicity? Because then it's getting to the question of like, well, who are members of these individual local churches, and what constitutes that, and how is it tied to baptism? I'm thinking broadly, even just speaking about, how did the early Baptists who were Congregationalists think about membership in their church, whether Presbyterians can be members? I'd imagine that created some kind of tension between those parties who come out of the same stream of the Reformation, but now, if you start to think about the church in those terms, that does create some ecclesiological tension points, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think one of the interesting things about this whole baptismal debate, and I think this still plays out in our own day, is that in one sense, the issue kind of punches above its weight a little bit. It because it's so pointy in the life of the local church, and because it has practical ramifications, it's sort of one of these things that A, people have to make a decision about whether they like it or not, and B, those decisions are going to be visible and public in such a way that it makes it harder to worship together than disagreements over other issues might. So, for example, to the first point, one of the interesting things when you look at the history in this period in the 17th century, one of the things that often causes a person to, and you just see this just come up again and again, what often causes a person to rethink his or her view on baptism is they're having a baby of their own. So a couple will have, they're expecting a child, and all of a sudden they start questioning, should we baptize babies? And now we actually really have to decide, because there's going to be a baby here, Lord willing, in 4 more months, and we either have to baptize it or not, and everybody's going to know what we choose. Whereas if you're sitting there thinking about, limited atonement, and you're pondering that, that can be a private matter between you and the Lord, and you're wrestling with that, or you're unsettled feelings about that doctrine, A, might not be known to anybody, and even if you share with some people, you can kind of keep that to yourself and you work on it and you wrestle with it. With this, it's pointy. You have to kind of deal with it. And so you're right. It does raise all sorts of issues and questions. What we find, interestingly, is during this period, it's a really fluid sort of thing with a lot of different approaches operative. So you'll find many examples of congregational churches during this period that had people of Paedobaptist conviction, and they were all just sort of happily worshiping together. Again, much like we see today, our family has worshipped and been members of a Presbyterian church, and our Paedobaptist convictions were known to the pastor and to the leadership, and it was all fine, and it all worked. I wasn't trying to change the doctrinal platform of the church. I wasn't agitating or causing any trouble about that, but it was not a secret, and it worked. And you see that kind of thing happening in the mid-17th century as well. You also see some who take a much harder line and say, no, this is really important, and we all have to agree on this. And if you don't agree, go elsewhere. So what I think we see in the mid-17th century is a real fluid time where they are trying to wrestle with this and trying to figure this out. That hardens a little bit more as the century goes on. And by the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, you get some much more kind of strict sense of denominational lines and denominational boundaries. But during the period we're talking about, late 30s, the 40s, the 50s, it's really in flux, it's fluid. And I think that reflects what to me is quite interesting, which is namely that these people don't have the categories that you and I have. We're sitting here talking and we're talking about, a Credo-Baptist church or a Paedobaptist church, and Presbyterians or Paedobaptists, and we have all these categories. Well, we're the beneficiaries, or at least we're living in the world created by hundreds of years of having these conversations. In the 1640s, nobody had been having these conversations, and so it's all new. And that's why one of my sort of issues in the book, in Orthodox Radicals, the subtitle is Baptist Identity in the English Revolution. And it's really trying to wrestle with, okay, what does it mean to have a Baptist identity in a period when, you're some of the first people to sort of inhabit that category. So what does that look like? How do they think of themselves? And one of the main points, and you touched on it already, and the title kind of gets at it, is I think these are people who really thought of themselves as basically in this Orthodox, lower C Catholic stream of Puritan divinity, but they reassess this one doctrinal point. But reassessing this one doctrinal point, though it's important and significant, it doesn't necessarily create for them this new well-formed, ready-made category called, well, we're Baptists now with a big B. That didn't exist at this time. It becomes a thing,
I see.
But
it's kind of an anachronism then, because we're using these modern categories. I mean, did the early Congregationalists who were not baptizing infants, did they? Because baptism and membership seem to be tied. Or when did that tie come into being? Because I can see it's an easier fit for a Credo Baptist family to attend a Presbyterian church and just go, we won't just let us, we're not going to baptize infants, but you guys, versus
be.
Yeah, versus the flip. I think it would be harder for a Presbyterian couple to join a Baptist church, because then the Presbyterian church would accept a child who's been baptized, or a teenager, whatever, they're baptized at 18, something like that. They would accept that as a baptism. Whereas it seems like the flip, it would be mutually exclusive, and they wouldn't be able to accept an infant baptism. And then that ties to whether they would accept their membership. When does that start to develop? Because that seems to be something, at least today, I mean, there's different schools of thought on that, of like basically I'm asking about open membership and open communion. Those types of things are sort of the sticking points today, even among like-minded, Reformed evangelical Christians. And what is the lineage of that? Was that an early thought? Was that something that developed Just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're right. And you put your finger on the that connection then again between a congregational polity and the whole logic of paedobaptism. So again, if I'm in a national church context where we have essentially universal infant baptism, and from my earliest day, then I am a part of the Christian church, broadly conceived, having been baptized in the triune name with water, and I am a member, as it were, of this national church. But I don't have any option in that. And the logic there is sort of you're in until you prove through openly scandalous living that you should be disciplined and kicked out, as opposed to a congregational model that says, hey, we're going to accept you into membership upon profession of faith and upon a credible profession of faith, a sort of, insofar as we're able, we want to look for fruit in your life and a sense that you actually are trusting in Christ, that you have been born again. They didn't imagine that they had magical powers to see people's hearts, but they said, as one congregational writer put it, the difference between us and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians is we feel like, neither one of us can keep unregenerate people out of the church infallibly. But our conviction is we need to do all we can now to try to minimize that gap. So anyway, so that's this larger discussion. And you're right. It then creates all of these question marks about, well, who should be a member, and does that fit with paedobaptism? And you're right, there's an asymmetry between a Paedobaptist church tolerating a Credo-Baptist family. They recognize the baptism of the parents as valid and legitimate. If they want to hold off on baptizing their children, well, we're going to just sort of let that go. As opposed to a Baptist congregation who now is being asked to potentially affirm a baptism that they don't view as a baptism at all. You got this baby wet, but that's not what the New Testament is imagining when it talks about baptism. So that is a huge asymmetry. It persists into our own day, absolutely. And these people were wrestling with that tension. And again, you see differences of opinion. You don't have loads of, I'm not sure if I can think of too many examples of like Presbyterian or Anglican people who want to join a Baptist church, but aren't convinced of Credo-Baptism's biblical truth, right? You just don't have that.
Because you don't have that today either, well, at least not a lot.
You don't have it as much. But, if you think about it, like, why would that happen today? Well, it might well be that you move to whatever town and the best, most vibrant, most faithful church is a Baptist church. And maybe it's a smaller town and there's not a lot of options. And this is a great church family. I agree with them on everything, but I'm a Paedobaptist by conviction, and I might want to do that. Well, in England, in this period, it's very unlikely that the best, most vibrant, only church option in your area would have been a Baptistic church. That's just like not going to happen, right? There's lots of churches. Very few of them are Baptistic, and they're seen as very odd. And for a lot of this history, that would have actually been an illegal view to hold. So there's not a lot of inducement for a Paedobaptist to join a Baptist church unless they've actually flipped on that issue. So you didn't see that too much, but still, even still, you do see different opinions amongst Baptistic church leaders on the extent to which you can have an openness to Paedobaptists in your congregation. And so, the most famous example is John Bunyan's church in Bedford, where they would have, he wrote on water baptism, no bar to communion. This idea that, hey, we shouldn't actually make disagreements over this issue of baptism kind of things that divide us if we're otherwise like-minded, and shouldn't divide us at the communion table. So that would be he would be on one sort of end of the spectrum. You had other people, like there was a fellow called Henry Jesse, who was a very important leader amongst Baptists, and he was much more open, and he basically treated it as, look, we disagree on this. They have their reasons, we have our reasons, but we are really on the same page, and we should try to work together and work more closely together. So you have those more open folks. You then have people who, from a relatively early phase, are much more insistent on, no, baptism is the logical prerequisite to the Lord's Supper. Baptism is your entrance into the people of God, and the Lord's Supper is the ongoing emblem of your good standing within the people of God. And so if you're not baptized, you can't participate. And if you've not been baptized upon profession of faith, you've not been baptized at all. And they're much more strong on that. And I would say the difference often between the people who are more flexible and who are more rigid, they probably actually agree on the logic of what I just said. Henry Jesse wouldn't deny any of that. It's just, okay, what do we do with it now that we actually have these real people who want in some way to be a part of what we're doing, and how do we deal with it on the ground? And that's where the differences often came out.
Yeah, the hard thing is the closed communion is odd to me, because if you insist upon the universal church, and that you would say that you have this eternal communion with your Presbyterian brother, that they're converted, and that in the new creation you will be communing with each other, then it seems odd to not participate in that now. That there would be a more fundamental unity that is encapsulated by the Lord's Supper that you'd want to participate in now. Like, it just seems odd. I don't know how saying you can't have the supper would not be a sign of excommunication. I mean, there's a sense in which when Roman Catholics don't let Protestants take their Eucharist, they are intending a kind of separation that is very significant. And so that's always a struggling point I've wondered. And I know, yeah, and I'd heard that Bunyan, and I hadn't heard of the other man that you had referenced, but I think that they're probably struggling with that reality, because it does, practically speaking, just, it feels kind of insane to be like, man, if R.C. Sproul showed up, I would just pull the tray away from him and be like, go to the back. That just seems, now I know maybe that's just, feelings, and facts don't care about your feelings and all that type of stuff. But I think that is a kind of pressing point where I'm like, man, I don't know. Do you just have to be happily inconsistent on that? And was that a conflict among the Baptists as they were working through that issue?
Yeah, I think it is a conflict that just is inherently there. The way the issues are arranged, it's just there. Mm-hmm. You can't get away from it. It's funny you mentioned if R.C. Sproul, showed up at my church. We had the same conversation, the elders and I, when I was pastoring the church in Southwest Georgia. We were wrestling with the same question, except we always imagined Sinclair Ferguson would be. He was always the paradigmatic example of the Presbyterian.
Yeah, the archetype of Presbyterianism.
And admire and have been so richly blessed by.
Yeah.
And it just felt like to us, and this is now not talking so much history. This is just the way I've thought about it in response to what you're saying. It just feels like I think that the logic is correct, that Lord's Supper is the entry point. Baptism is the entry point. Lord's Supper is the ongoing mark of participation. Excommunication, if you're under church discipline, what is the big thing that we're allowed to do as church officers? Exclude you from the table, which is a sign that you have been, to use Paul's words, not mine, handed him over to Satan. And you're not a part of the people of God right now, or at least we're not recognizing you. So it's very serious. So thinking about that in relation to this issue, while I absolutely see the logic of excluding from the table those who have not been baptized by my lights as a Baptist, it just felt like, what, we've taken we just can't, I don't want to be in the place where we're excluding, Sinclair Ferguson from the table. Now, it raises other questions, though. You can push that too far. Would you let him be a regular? Well, put Sinclair Ferguson to the side.
Just biases. You're like, absolutely, whatever he wants.
Would you allow a good Presbyterian, to be, take the Lord's Supper as a one-off when they're visiting? That's one question.
Yeah.
Would you allow them to be a member in perpetuity? And then at that point, by your lights as a Baptist, you have unbaptized members on your membership roll. How does that work? Then, even if you're comfortable with that, though, then it's like, well, would you let that person be an elder in your church? So it becomes tricky. It becomes tricky very quickly. At our church, one thing that we thought was weird, though, was that we would allow and did allow Paedobaptist brothers to preach on a Sunday. And it just felt too weird to say you can preach the sermon and open God's word to us, but you can't take the Lord's Supper when you're done. That just felt. So I think, a happy inconsistency. I don't know, a recognition that this side of glory, the lines will never always fully connect. And we have to do our best, and again, as a Baptist, I think, and I would say the same if I was a Presbyterian, but in reverse, this tension exists because I believe some brothers and sisters who I love and respect are just not getting this one right. And so it creates then these tensions and these weirdnesses. So there is a part where I think, well, that's not my fault. And they would say the same about me. But I have to try to now live with that as best I can.
Did the early Baptist congregations, did they make a strong connection between membership and baptism? Because it does seem like, is it even, because it's interesting you do those delineations of like, okay, are you open with communion and then are you open with membership? But it does seem like open communion and open membership, they would go together. It would be like, did they think that in the early days of being like, okay, we're going to give communion, like, did they have that view where we could give communion to, like, did Bunyan think we could give communion to a Presbyterian, but he can't be a member? Or did he view those two as tied together?
Yeah. So again, I think Bunyan's church is a little bit of an outlier in that it would be the most sort of fluid on these points. I think much more. It would be quite normal to say, if we're a Baptistic church, you need to be baptized to be a member of our church. We are. In fact, they called themselves often, the baptized believers gathering at Warboys or wherever the town was. So so that connection, that's much more, I think, normal. I think the bigger. The question about the Lord's Supper is a further step. If you have people visiting, what if you're visiting somewhere else and can you take the Lord's Supper in a place that doesn't practice believers' baptism? For some of them, that kind of thing would be a problem. So you really just get lots of different combinations and permutations on these things, and there's a diversity that again, we still see it today. We have examples of churches that try all kinds of different mediating positions on this, and well, you can do this, but you can't do that. Or there are churches that practice both. They have, like, say the pastor is Paedobaptist. I've seen this multiple times. But there might be a guy on staff who's Paedobaptist. And if you want your infant baptized, that pastor will baptize them. And they try to kind of do a both and thing. So there's all sorts of different ways I think people have tried to wrestle with this. And again, I think it just flows from it's kind of just baked into the cake that we're going to have to wrestle and make some compromises, and any road you take, it feels like there's this little bit of tension that you're left with. And so it's sort of, what kind of tension do you want to deal with?
When these Baptist congregations, did they view like a Presbyterian church or an Anglican local church, did they view that as a legitimate church?
Certainly, they had very nice things to say about Presbyterians and Congregationalists. There would be more mixed, reviews of the established church. Anglican church. So the term Anglican as an adjective isn't as operative in this period, but I get your point. Yeah, the national church tied to the episcopacy, and some of the Baptist folks that, like I would talk about in the book, had a very jaundiced view of the national church. Like, you don't attend it, you don't hear that preaching. You can't be. Here's another one. Can you be buried in the churchyard of the local parish church? Because if you think about it, again, we're all used to, there's all these different cemeteries and options, and pick your favorite one, and we'll fly you back to your hometown, and you can do whatever you want, right? Well, for them, it's like, no, you're in this little village, and there's a burying place, and it's in the gate of the parish church, because that's how this whole society is organized and operated. Well, now your grandmother passes. Can she be buried there? Is that okay? So there were all these questions that they had to wrestle with and were confronted with because of the exigencies of the situations. And you got different answers.
What's so helpful with this conversation is it shows how theology is never done just abstractly, but history and circumstances pushes people to think through things, and they're doing it in real time. And it can be a messy process, but it's really, really cool to see some of the narrative behind this and the story behind this. Just thinking about the future, you're thinking about what can Baptists or Credo Baptists, if they're not explicitly, a Baptist church, what can they learn from this period of history, and what can we recapture from these folks who from Congregationalism went toward a more Credo Baptist route? What are things that we can learn from them and apply today?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. On a basic level, in terms of thinking about, the subtitle of the book, as I mentioned, was Baptist Identity in the English Revolution. And I think for ourselves, thinking about what is our Baptist identity, like who are we? I think I would just want to encourage folks to say, there is a history there is a tradition. If you follow the lines backwards, what you find is English-speaking Calvinistic Baptists emerged from the soil of Puritanism and the Reformed tradition. And so I think we need to see that and realize that is our heritage. That is where we're rooted, very much in this Reformation soil, this Reformed soil, and that there is a unity there with others in that tradition. Baptists don't sort of spring out fully formed from some separate third rail or something. So I think there's the identity question. I think it's useful there. I think practically speaking, it's a good reminder to me of all sorts of things. I mean, for one, I'll just give you one real quick. We're running out of time here, but I think that one thing I see in the early modern English Calvinistic Baptists that has, at least in a lot of Baptist circles, been maybe lost or at least sidelined a bit, is the goodness that comes from cooperating with other Baptist churches. I think we sometimes think, okay, we're Baptist, we're congregational, we're independent, the buck stops here, the local church is the final authority in matters of church discipline and that sort of thing. So that means we're just sort of on our own. And that's not how these early English Baptists saw it. They, and the Congregationalists as well, they were much more connected to one another than are, I think, a lot of us today in our local churches. And I know that's hard. It's hard to organize. And when I was a pastor, I mean, who has the time to, and energy sometimes for that? But to the extent we could recapture a sense of cooperation amongst like-minded churches, I think that would all be to the good. And there's some good groups that are trying to do that. And then thirdly and finally, I think to me, church history is just so helpful, whether this story or any story, to just remind us that we are not going through anything that other believers haven't gone through. That the challenges we face, while they might be unique in the sense that 2025 and wherever it is that we're rooted, there are particularities. I'm not just saying that's not the case, but in terms of the substance of it, we're not facing anything that hasn't been faced before by brothers and sisters in the past. And I think looking to them and looking to the way they wrestled and they prayed and they sacrificed is an encouragement to us in our own situation, and one we should take more time to recapture and recover.
It's well said and very, very, very helpful. Matthew Bingham, thank you so much for being part of this and for your research in this area. And I think it's just a helpful resource. We'll put links to Orthodox Radicals and your new book in our show notes as well. Make sure you guys pick that up. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Brian. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.